Good evening. Welcome to this Providence School Board Finance Committee meeting. The time is 5:33 p.m. and we will begin this meeting. First order is to convene the meeting. Do I have a motion to approve?
I have a motion to approve.
So moved. The second item on the agenda is to approve the agenda. Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve.
So moved. The next item is to approve the consent of the minutes from January 10th, 2024. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda,
Motion to
the
approve.
minutes? So moved. Okay, we're going to jump right into the reports on the contracts, but we'll start with item 4.1, Senior School District Administrator hiring of the Chief Academic Officer.
So good evening, Madam Chair and members of the Finance Committee. I'm Herman James, I'm the Talent Officer for Providence School District. And on behalf of the Superintendent, Dr. Montanez, I would like to present the selection and appointment of a Senior School District Administrator in Providence Public Schools. Dr. Paula Dillon has been selected as the Chief of Academics, CAO for Providence Public Schools. I'd like to just pause there for a minute and just provide you both with a copy of her resume. Dr. Dillon joins Providence Public Schools District with more than 20 years of experience in curriculum and instruction, special education, and performance management. She recently served as a assistant superintendent, for curriculum and instruction with Barrington Public Schools in Barrington, Rhode Island for 12 years, and as an assistant superintendent for teaching, learning, and special populations in East Greenwich Public Schools in East Greenwich, Rhode Island for 4 years. Always a passionate teacher at heart, Dr. Dillon served as a special education resource and inclusion classroom teacher for 13 years. Dr. Dillon is thrilled to officially accept the role of Chief Academic Officer at Providence Public Schools. Her decision to join the PPSD team is underpinned by a collective dedication to the firm belief that every student can learn at high levels and positively impact their future. This shared commitment is fortified by a steadfast emphasis on robust instructional support, a holistic approach to nurturing the whole child, and the utilization of exceptionally high-quality instructional materials. In her initial 2 months, she plans to familiarize herself with the goals of each department, conduct a thorough analysis of internal student data, and strategically begin to refine the instructional model in curriculum and instruction. She will compare the internal data with any initial analysis from the RIDE data portal, adjusting initial impressions accordingly. In addition, she will engage in a root cause analysis of identified areas of need and outline potential threats to plans to proactively mitigate potential barriers. She is committed to implementing short-term actions to immediately support student success on RICAS, PSAT, and SAT assessments. These efforts will serve as a foundation for the long-term alignment between academic goals and increased student engagement, propelling overall achievement to new heights. She is genuinely excited about the opportunity to contribute to the educational landscape of Providence Public Schools and the state of Rhode Island. She looks forward to fostering a culture of collaboration, innovation, and excellence that will positively impact the educational journey of every student in this district. She would like to say thank you for entrusting her with this significant responsibility, and she is eager to embark on this journey and contribute to the continued success of Providence Public Schools. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What's Paula's background with Providence? Is there anything in particular, like, what's just attracted to here? She seems there to learn, right?
She's currently with us. She's
Okay.
been hired by
She's
Providence
already
Public, so she's hired with us this time. This is information only
Okay.
to share with you and to certainly present to you this senior district administrator.
Thank you. I do show that Ms. Dillon did present the Highlander Blended Learning Conference back in 2014 at Providence. I'm a blended learner myself. I'm very impressed with that, and I think she'll make an excellent addition to the executive team here.
Thank you very much. You'll be seeing her around at different meetings.
I look forward to it. We do have a question from Mr. Stevens, who is present here as well this evening.
Yes, how's everyone doing? Really quick, thank you, Chairwoman. For the Providence School Department job description, it says reasons for opening, it says replacement, then it says replacement for the deputy superintendent of, but it doesn't say of what. Do you know exactly what that position is speaking of?
I don't know what you're reading from.
Yes, it's the Providence
School
School
Board member.
Department, it's the job description that was sent to us, it's on the Secretary of State's page.
And it's a job description for what position?
It's for the chief academic officer.
Okay.
Then it says that it's replacing the deputy superintendent of, but it doesn't mention what it's of.
Okay, so I think it was like that superintendent of academics.
Char Bradford's old role.
Old role, an old position that might have been in place at one time. And chief academic officer is now replacing that particular position.
The last person in the role was Yvonne Alvarez.
Okay, and, so I have a question. So maybe that should have been replacement for the chief of academics. It says deputy superintendent. That's probably a typo.
Might be a typo.
And then one last question. Why isn't she here today?
She's out on leave this week due to previous engagements.
Okay.
Are there any other further questions regarding Ms. Dillon's curriculum background or any other questions regarding the job or the position? Hearing none. Thank you so much for the
Thank you.
background
Thank you,
information.
Chairman.
Welcome aboard, Ms. Dillon. Do we have a motion to approve item 4.1?
Motion moved.
So moved. Moving on, we have item 4.2 for the E-rate products and services, the basic maintenance contract.
Good evening, Chairwoman and members of the Finance Committee, South Lorana Chief Operating Officer. So what we have here is the E-rate contract for basic, as you said, basic maintenance for our network. And it is necessary to keep our technology and equipment in proper working conditions to support the district's network infrastructure. Custom Computer Specialist has been a vendor of PPSD for quite some time, with well over 40 years of experience in the K-12 industry. The funding sources for this this purchase are the E-rate federal program, so that's 85% comes from the federal program and 15% comes out of our local budget. The item 4.2 is specifically to the network infrastructure. So that's to maintain all of our systems, their hourly rate based on the engineering labor that has been, submitted in the RFP. Happy to answer any questions. You have a supplemental packet that breaks down the full cost of the $552,500.
Thank you. Do you have any questions, Mr. Mayor?
No questions right now.
Thank you for that overview. In regards to the invoicing, how often does CCS request or submit the invoices for reimbursements, please? Do we have that information?
So Mr. Patisi can help here, but one of the unique relationships that with this vendor is that they handle all of the invoicing directly with the federal government, right? So we're not interjecting with any of the invoicing. We're just required to pay the 15% from our local dollars.
Yeah, so this is a unique situation that we don't, it's not on a reimbursable basis, so they take care of the billing directly with the feds, so we don't have to put out $500,000 and then ask for reimbursement, so it helps us in the cash flow position.
In addition to helping us with the administrative, burden that has, so we wouldn't have, the district doesn't have to account for that because they do it directly.
And do you know if this falls under category 1 or category 2 for the E-rate program?
The basic maintenance is category 1. Category 2 is the internal connections, which is the next item.
The only other question I had, were any of these services classified for Wi-Fi, with the services for the internet access, either on buses or?
So again, this one is maintenance to all of our network infrastructure at the district. The internal connections does encompass the Wi-Fi and the internet provider. If I leave anything out, please let me know. But so one is particularly about the infrastructure and the maintenance of those equipments and the life cycle, troubleshooting any issues that may come up, engineering to address any issues that may come up. And then the other one is particularly on the internet service provider and all the internal connections to make those network switches work and all of that.
Understood. The only reason why I asked is because the 2014 second E-rate order, as outlined by the FCC, it states that the data plans and ear cards for mobile devices and Wi-Fi services, looks like they have some different cost-effective options. And internal broadband access is different. So that's the only reason why I asked. But it sounds like the vendor would handle all those varying factors.
That's correct. And because the relationship they have with the district, they're very well versed on the components of our infrastructure and our network itself. They're very, very familiar because they helped maintain it over the last few years. So it costs down on any, discovery or anything that any other particular vendor may have to come in and do.
I have a lot of questions. Do you have any at this point, Mr. Neva?
No, I don't.
Okay, very good. Do we have a motion to approve 4.2 E-rate products and service for dates and maintenance?
Motion to approve?
So moved. Moving right along, we'll go to item 4.3 for E-rate products and services, the internal connections.
Great. So let's begin. This is, again, same vendor, custom computer specialist. This is for a set of schools listed here. And how we get to those schools is based on information on the infrastructure, the age of the devices, the life cycle that they have. And it includes the equipment and services that are necessary to keep the school network and technology equipment up to date. In today's technology, again, it's same sort of structure in terms of the finances. It's 85% of the federal government and 15% from our local share. Again, happy to answer any particular questions you may have.
Steve, do you have any regarding this contract?
Is this contract something that we always have to do like annually?
So we have the set of schools. The team does a full analysis of what's coming up in terms of replacement, life cycles, devices, switches, anything that's sort of like maintaining our infrastructure and our network. And through the E-rate federal program, we're able to do that on a yearly basis and decide which schools are up for total renew or total redo in terms of the network based on the end life of those devices.
I have a question. Does this include like cameras and stuff like that? Or is that separate?
No, that is a separate bucket, but it does include any infrastructure to run those. So internet access points, cabling, the network switches that may control cameras, but this is sort of like the back end.
So one person would come in and do the cables, and then someone else would come in and do the cameras?
That is correct. Network, switches, cabling, so is separate from the camera vendor.
Thank you.
Is there a breakdown for like what each school is getting specifically?
Yes. So on the third page of that one, you have the dollar amount by school, but there is a spreadsheet that we'd be happy to share that has a list of all of the devices that would be upgraded or replaced that would add up to each of those amounts. And that's a combination of switches, WAPs, which are wireless access points.
Yeah, just looking because I see that like some schools are getting like 22,000, 21,000, and then other ones are just getting like 11,000. Just to kind of like see.
Which one are you seeing? I'm sorry. Oh, no, that is for item 4.1. So that is just purely
So just
hourly
like-
rate. Yes.
Okay.
So this one that you're looking at that has the schools and the budgets, those are actual infrastructure. So those are equipment, switches.
How come
Wireless
PCTA is
access
getting so
points.
much?
It has to do with the size of the building
Okay.
and what is needed to be able to provide the internet, service that is in that building. So that's determined by the square footage of the building, the size of the network in that particular school. That's why the budgets are so
Because it's a technical school, they probably have more.
correct. They may have more requirements.
Give us some breakdown, because actually that was something I was trying to
Yeah, well, so it's
research
fine.
myself, and there's a whole list of,
Yeah, it's just
Qualifying
pages upon
difference.
pages where you see model number,
yes,
age,
right.
what needs to be replaced. So I can certainly share that.
Thank you.
Chairwoman? Chairwoman?
Yes, Mr. Stevens,
I have a question really quick. So
please.
so you do have, in fact, the breakdown, right, for each individual school? That's what you said, right?
For the infrastructure, yes, the
Okay.
network that's being replaced.
What typically is sort of probably the pricing, which we'll probably get if you have the Excel sheet. What is pricing, or what do you see typically that's pricing in all of these different schools that you think really sort of needs to be replaced? If you understand what I'm saying?
I think I understand your question, but again, I'll go back to it's the actual infrastructure. So network switches to help run all of the wireless access points, all of the infrastructure that's connected into each of the classrooms. So like when you think about smart boards, all of the cables and the behind the wall stuff that is feeding those connections is what's included in those budgets.
And what's the current network structure that we have currently? Are you sure?
In what
Or
sense?
just in general, like what are we currently using besides this contract that we're trying to approve? Is there something similar that we're currently using?
Oh, yes, it is what we've been using. It's just because they're coming to an end life. So each network switch is,
So should this be probably listed under renewal and not new? If we're renewing something like this?
yeah, it's because it has to go out to bid and go through that process. That's why it's new.
Got it.
But the equipment itself it's the same models that we've been using, just upgraded technology, because they've reached their end life.
Okay, and then, how many specialists are we expecting to probably do a lot of this work and working with you?
So CCS staff, as part of their
Yeah.
contractual obligations, they staff it. So it depends again on the size of the building and what is needed to perform that work.
Got it.
But they own, not only just coming up with the pricing list of the equipment, but also the work plan and the staff that is required to execute that overhaul.
Got it. Chairwoman, really quick, what I'll do is, not what I'll do, but what I'll advise is that probably you push the district when it pertains to contracts, probably over $1 million to probably provide a little bit more detailed at the meetings, at the finance committee meetings to approve it. I think it's very important that, we spoke about it when I was on the committee, that we have line details of what to expect, the school breakdown of what to expect there. Definitely like PCTA, I think is very important, just to know the breakdown. It is a larger space in school, but where the specifics is gonna go and be dished out, definitely with $1 million contracts. That's all.
Yeah.
That's duly noted. And
So if
Mr.
I can
Newman
just
did request that.
remind, so what you see here is the full contract,
Mhm.
right? But our expense to the district is not the 1,044,000. It's 15% of that, because the rest is done by the federal E-rate program. But yes, we can definitely provide that spreadsheet that has by school, and it has every item that's being replaced, because it either has reached life cycle, the end of life, and is up for upgrade.
Do we know how often, so these items that are gonna be replaced, do we have any information on, for example, like how often we have to keep replacing those every year?
Yeah, some of them range between 5 to 7 to as much as 10 years of life cycle. So that spreadsheet tells you when it was initially purchased, installed, and when it's approaching its life cycle. So we already have that planned out to like 2027, I believe.
Okay.
This is just a yearly process, because you have to submit an application each year. But that spreadsheet has years out, look ahead.
And all of this has been all these replacements have been discussed with the principals of the schools and everything.
So it's not they're aware that it's happening, but it's not something we want to take up their time, because it's again on the back end of the work in terms of the infrastructure of that building. But they are aware of what schools are being upgraded, so that they know that work happens mostly over the summer when they're not necessarily in school session, because we don't want to impact any student learning time. We go out to them with hey, you're up for renewal or upgrade. Here's a list of all the things that are being changed. The walkthroughs happen. That's how the bids are, received.
So
So that
principals are a part of the walkthrough?
they're informed. If they want to be, they can. They certainly can. But they're informed of when they're up for renewal or upgrade, and they're notified as to what's being upgraded.
Just asking because just to understand how, if they're the ones using mainly the facilities and the things that are going to be replaced, figuring out if the replacement is even worth switching or changing or getting something else. But that's what I'm trying to find out, if they're a part of the walkthrough, if they're the ones asking for this stuff, or if it's just this is just what we do every year and that's it, and don't bat an eye.
You could.
I think some of this ends up being, so it'll be hey, the Wi-Fi router has a useful life of 5 years, and we're coming up on our 5th year. So, we don't want to wait until it breaks. We just will go through, and there are things, if we're doing something in a school what's a facility example? Where we'll do a walkthrough because we're installing a new water fountain or something that they care about. This stuff they may not even think about, because it's about making sure the Wi-Fi is working.
It's all the network closets, right? So it's those racks that are, has all the switches, all the connections. It's mainly stuff that they don't necessarily interact with, but we know it has a specific end of life or cycle. And so we don't want to wait until it becomes a problem and then we have to replace it as a reactive measure. So we again look at all of those, have a very detailed spreadsheet by building, when it was installed, when it was purchased, when it's due for renewal or upgrade. Then we inform them of like, hey, your school is now in that rotation. We're gonna be coming out to review. We'll always get feedback from them about like connectivity issues, anything like that. The majority of that gets resolved when you do these upgrades. And then we let them know when the project kicks off.
Have we done any evaluation of the brands that we're using for these things, or are we just using the same brands over and over again?
No, we do, and that's what these folks are really industry experts and always stay abreast of like latest technology and what is recommended or what is standard across K-12 environments.
Thank you.
On that note, I believe from my research, the FCC only requires designated brands that are, in this program. And looking at, it is, a significant, amount for the contract and potential supply chain restrictions, if you will. So, adding on to that, has there been any concern about restrictions with those type of orders or restrictions regarding the product in of itself?
Not that I'm aware, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. So COVID was a perfect example of that, right? Like there were devices where, because of the pandemic, they were short of like. Luckily, we had equipment that we could react to if it's needed, but not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions. Ms. Hughes, did you have?
No, I think everything was.
Madam, really quick, Madam Chair, I think
Yes, Mr. Steve.
the final question I just have, how did the district select these schools, and were there any other schools that sort of needed, like to sort of be renewed and repair their process?
Yeah, again, these are on a rotation cycle because of the devices and they're coming to end of life.
Got it.
So that's how they're selected. And again, we have a plan all the way through 2027.
Got it.
So we know what schools are going to come to that point each year.
Got it.
And then every year we go through this process to put that RFP out and make sure that we are ahead of the curve to keep our network infrastructure in good shape.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Nina, if you don't have any other further questions, I make a motion to approve item 4.3 for the E-rate product and services for the internal connections.
Motion.
So moved.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Moving right along, we have item 4.4 for Maxim Healthcare Contract Revision.
Good evening, Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee. I'm Dr. Jennifer Connolly, the Executive Director of Special Education here in Providence Public Schools. I come before you tonight to request an adjustment to our contract with Maxim Healthcare. We currently contract with Maxim to provide intensive, often individual nursing services to some of our students with significant disabilities in order for them to attend school. We currently have about 9 students that require this level of service across the district. We do work with 2 other agencies that provide nursing services, but Maxim has been able to produce the most nurses to meet the needs of our students. And we had initially budgeted for $250,000, but are finding that we need to increase it. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you.
Is there a paper
Any
that comes?
questions?
I didn't bring the initial contract.
Is there any more papers of this item?
Copies.
Any more copies?
I do not have the original contract agreement. I do recall approving the original contract earlier this year, or last year, I should say. But no, I don't have any other documentation at this time.
Question. So I'm not familiar with some of the services that you provide. Can you give me an example of what do you do during like a regular school day with the students?
So relative to this contract, Some of our students have significant physical and health impairments. They may have ventilators, they may need assistance eating, they may have feeding tubes, they may need catheterization, they need a pretty high level of medical care in order to attend school. So these nurses support these students for the IEP process so that they can attend school.
And is there any type of support from their health insurance companies or?
While a lot of these students do have nursing care around the clock, that's provided by the parents' health insurance, but during the school day, the school district is responsible for whatever level of support the student needs in order to attend school. So we are responsible for the school portion of the day. Some of these students also require this care on the bus as well, but when the student's at home, it's covered by the parents' health insurance.
And is the amount that the increase in the amount, is that going to be just to maintain the level of services provided now, or is it going to be adding maybe an extra nurse or something like that?
Yeah, this changes all the time. A student could move out of the district, a student could move into the district. We have students that qualify for special education year round, so it does fluctuate. We did estimate we have a current gap right now that we need to fill. We tried to estimate out what our needs would be, but it's impossible to know for certain because this is such an individual service.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the service.
Of course, thank you.
Ms. Connolly, the only question I had was you mentioned in your presentation that you had currently 8 students in this program.
It's 8 students across the school
Across.
district. It's actually more than that
Right.
total,
That's what the
but for
contract
this
says.
contract, for this amount, at this moment, it's for 8 students. We have kids that are in pre-K, we have kids that attend like Meeting Street School, Cornerstone. We have kids that are in our district. We have elementary school students, middle school and high school students that have this level of health need. So these are kids all across the district, but all Providence students.
And the additional $229,000 that you're requesting will carry us through only until the end of June.
Yes. And then we start the new fiscal year.
I have no other questions regarding this. I'd like to make a motion to approve the Maxim Healthcare contract revision.
Motion approved.
I second that, so moved. Thank you, Ms. Wiley.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda, we have the 4.5 item, Stepping Stone Group, another contract revision.
The next 2 are mine. So I come before you to respectfully request your approval for an adjustment to our Stepping Stones contract. Stepping Stones is a staffing agency that we use to fill some of our critical vacancy needs. Currently, they're providing us with school psychologists, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, and we are also using them for teaching assistants as well in some of our high need classrooms. Again, we had initially anticipated spending about $1 million. Fortunately, Stepping Stones has been able to provide us a high number of staff to fill these critical vacancies, which is why we're requesting the adjustment. As with the Maxim contract, we looked at the average of what we've spent to date and tried to estimate what we would need for the remainder of the year. But this also does fluctuate as if people are working for a staffing agency. They may come or go or move. They may find more people for us. We still have vacancies that we struggle with. So this does fluctuate as well.
Thank you. Christina, do you have any questions?
So with the original amount requested, it says it was 1 million.
Mhm.
What was included in that?
It was when the school year begins and we're looking at our vacancies and trying to staff, we'll reach out to all of our staffing agencies. We currently work with 9 that we accepted through the bid process to see what kind of staff they have available. And we try to allocate funds based on our estimate as to how many staff that they'll be able to provide us. We have been working very successfully with Stepping Stones for a couple of years now since I've been here. So we estimated how many staff Stepping Stones would be able to provide us. Fortunately for me, unfortunately for the budget, they found more people for us. But these are needs that were mandated. These are positions and services we are required to provide, like speech services, occupational therapy services. So that's why we are asking for the increase.
In the justification of spending, it states that the staffing agency may be used to fill critical vacancies despite intensive recruitment efforts, in early contracts and tiered bonuses. Are those bonuses paid by the district or are they paid by the staffing agency?
I was referring to the bonuses that the district was provided,
To
was
attract.
using for the last couple of years to find staff.
Can you just, I'm sorry, no, you go, you're the.
So, do you review this every 6 months? Is that why this is coming up now? Or do you do this in the very beginning of like the school year?
We usually allocate funds based on what we expect our needs to be. I set those funds aside through the purchasing process, but then it changes and fluctuates as more people get at it. I mean, honestly, if Stepping Stones calls me and says they have a speech language pathologist who wants to work for us, I hire them immediately because we have to get all of our students the services that they need. And so because of the change in the amount of staff that they've been able to provide us, we have an increase.
Thank you.
This is now my third year that I've been in the district. And it's been, the last couple of years since the pandemic, there's been just radical changes in everything. I'm hoping to kind of get a sense of what our needs are and do a better job of making sure that what we're allocating or contracting for will meet our needs. But we've just had so many changes. There's just been so many variables right now. It's hard to kind of get a sense of what our average cost would be for these types of services.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, they're certainly very critical services. Ms. Connolly, the contract itself, it's, the purchaser contract is not filled in. So I would assume this would be contract like the other
Yes.
one. So
Yes.
that would need to be updated.
Okay.
And then in the staff recommendations, the school name it should be filled in as district-wide on the, where that blank section is. And I think everything else looks in order. According to the additional amount requested and the breakdown on the spending, the second page. So having those edits done, I would make a motion to approve this contract unless there's any other questions or concerns. Mr. Stevens?
Yes, really quick, sorry, my eyes, allergies. Okay, what was the original price and what's the price now, the revised price? I can't pull it up on my electronic copy.
It was originally $1 million. We're requesting an increase of $995,000. So the current request is $1,995,000.
Oh,
Got it, okay. And is there a breakdown as it pertains to the amount of individuals you have in fact hired? Because I know you said that they have been effective. I know it'd be good if this committee would have, been given a copy of the breakdown of the individuals that's been hired, and so forth.
We currently have 3 school psychologists, 1 occupational therapist, 12 speech language pathologists, and we most recently started using them for teaching assistants. I estimate, I don't have those current invoices. I think at this point we have 3 to 5 teaching assistants, but that also changes frequently.
And what was the amount of sort of like specialists and different things that you sort of mentioned, what was that amount before this vendor came on board? Did they hire all of them, or did they sort of mix in and fill in where they can fill in?
The staffing agencies hire the staff and they pay the staff. We pay the staffing agency for all of the staff.
Mhm.
So these individuals, although they work here in our schools, they're not Providence Public School employees.
Got it. So I'm saying, so Providence Public Schools, so we don't, how can I word it? Because I want to make sure that I'm clear. So Providence Public Schools, so we haven't hired any of those individuals at all?
Correct.
Okay,
We
and then,
can't,
mhm.
the way the contract's written, they provide us the staff and there's always a clause that says that we can't hire them. We'd love to. A lot of them would come and work for us. Some of them prefer to work for the agencies, but the whole setup is that they work for the staffing agencies. It's the same thing with Maxim.
Got it. And then what's the reason you're requesting now an increase? Is it because we want to sort of hire some more individuals, or they need
No,
more?
we've hired more people, and the bills have increased.
Okay,
I will rephrase that. The staffing agency has provided more staff for us.
so we need to provide more funding for them. I got you. Okay.
Yes, yep. It's a little confusing.
No, I understand. Thank you so much.
I think that's a great question, Mr. Stevens, and I would appreciate, Dr. Connolly, if you could just forward that to us so we have it on file. I know staffing agencies, they're not, our employees, so some of that information is sensitive for payroll purposes, but certainly just like a high-level listing of who are we contracting with in terms of positions, so we have a little bit more backup to that, because I agree, it is a significant amount based on the original contract. It's almost close to 100 percentile for requesting additional funds. So great question. I appreciate it. Any other questions? Ms. Hughes?
Dr. Connolly, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this important work around providing our students with the highest needs, the services that they deserve and that we're legally required to provide. You mentioned that for the staffing agencies, you work with 9 total agencies. I'm wondering how this particular, like by requesting an increased amount with Stepping Stone, does that mean that you might be using less than you budgeted originally with other staffing agencies, or how might that impact both that balance and also the balance, because these are in theory positions that we'd prefer to fill by hiring directly through Providence schools, how does this affect that budget overall for staffing? And if you can't answer that, maybe some of our awesome finance team would be happy to answer that part.
I'll start and Dr. Conley jump in at any time. So when we put out these bids for these staffing agencies, historically we would put out bids for specialized areas. So when we put out the new bids, we put out a bid for a staffing agencies that could include OT, PT, speech, and psychologist services, because what we saw previously is if we put out a bid for that was unique to one service, they couldn't fulfill our need. But however, we were bound to that contract for OT or PT services. There was only one vendor that bid. Now we put out the bid so for vendors to provide multiple services. So to your point, we are seeing savings in other purchase orders because they can't fulfill our needs, but Maxim for some reason can fulfill our needs. So we are seeing, even though we're asking for $1 million to pay this one vendor, we'll see reductions and cancellations and additional POs because those vendors can't fulfill. Make sense? So can I answer
And
your question?
these are salaries that were budgeted that are vacant.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
that's what I was kind of getting at, that
Right.
like this feels like a big number on both of these last two
Yes.
things, but this is helpful, I think, for us to understand the bigger picture of the finances, to understand that this is increasing, but something else might be going down,
So-
Benefits and those fringe benefits that we'd have to pay,
for sure.
for sure, that the staffing agency pays for these
These
employees.
positions were budgeted for employees and salaries that we couldn't find. So now we're using the staffing agency So it is an increase in that regard, but a decrease.
It's not ESSA funded, right?
The staffing agencies, we use a combination for Stepping Stones specifically of local and IDEA funds for all of our staffing agencies.
But we're also seeing a historic student need as well. So
Correct.
we've never seen a need of students, so, even if we were to max out the number of positions that we would have budget, we also need to tap into agencies as well.
Having two students in my family that were special needs, actually three, one passed away. I know this is a growing need for these type of hard-to-fill services, but I think
There's also
that was great information.
There's also compensatory services
Yes.
that so the needs of the students they weren't receiving, whether it was during the pandemic or after the pandemic, that we have to make up for as well. So that's why the needs increasing too.
Any other questions,
Yeah.
or concerns?
Do you know if there are agencies that have the option of being able to hire or the options to allow us to hire the staff?
They all do it a little bit differently. Some have, because what they want to collect the money because they collect more than they pay their staff, and that's how they make their money. There are agencies that will let us buy out a staff. We pay, which seems like a difficult decision, but if we are going to get somebody who's worked here for a couple of years as a speech language pathologist and they want to join the team, it's something I think we need to consider. Other agencies have it built into the clause that the person can't work for us for a year and then can come in as an employee. The agencies that we use, their goal is to give the staff to us that we pay them for. They're not recruitment agencies or like headhunters that find a person to fill our position. So that's not the type of work that they do.
And are they, so I know it's temporary staffing, are there contracts involved? Like, I know you kind of just spoke on it a little, but is there a certain amount of time that they can be here for? So can they only be here for a year or 2 years? Is it limited?
No, I haven't encountered that. And we actually have, I know at least one employee who we've had for a couple of years since I've been here, who comes here every day and really is part of the team for work purposes, but she works for a staffing agency. So no, I haven't encountered that.
And then in terms of, so I guess specifically when I look at this, I'm thinking of a school psychologist. Are these employees only for students with IEPs? So like, for example, the school, obviously OT and speech, right, would be specific, but for something like the school psychologist, would that school psychologist only be used specifically for kids with IEPs or special needs?
No, that is kind of a shared role of predominantly helping students with disabilities, but they also support gen ed students as well.
Do we have a breakdown of the which schools getting the services? Like how are the students selected for this?
These are students with disabilities that are identified through the special ed process. And then they qualify for an IEP, an individualized education program. And that really, for each student, they're all done individually, determines what their level of need is. So that would say that process will indicate if they need speech therapy or occupational therapy or something like a nurse.
So, for example, if I was to see like a list of the schools, I would see like the similar amounts in each school, or
no, because some students just need like resource help, so they may just need help with reading. Some students have significant disabilities. We have specialized classrooms that we put in different schools, so it really does vary school to school.
There's no breakdown for that, like general breakdown?
yeah.
I could provide that. I could provide that in aggregate, like how many students have IEPs, but every IEP is different. Their needs are different.
It's just to get an idea of, like, for example, from the different each school, like what schools I will pay the most for,
Sure.
you know, which ones, you know,
Yep.
are getting the most services. In terms of,
It's a high level
Yes.
overview.
yeah,
Dr. Connolly, is it accurate that, you know, students will receive a mix of services? Some are from like a PTSD psychologist, or they could be getting it from, let's say there's a vacancy, this agency, so. Yeah, it's, students are receiving both from PTSD employees as well as not.
So you're asking me for a breakdown of what students with disabilities, the profile looks like across the district, right? Oh, yes, I can share that. I mean, we do a census for a ride twice a year. We do it in June and December. We hover around 4,000 students with disabilities total. Currently, it's about 3,800 students with disabilities, but there's a wide range. Some students may just get speech. Some students may have significant needs and need a nurse and, you know, multiple services.
so that's what I'm trying to figure out, like, do we have a breakdown of that? Like, for example, if I was to say, how many students at PCTA are receiving these services? And then like, which one of these other services are they getting? Because I'm pretty sure every school has different needs for those students.
Yeah, I would say every school has students with disabilities with a, you know, fairly significant amount of service.
Thank you.
I have another question. Is it cheaper to go through staffing as opposed to, I know that's not why I know we're having trouble staffing, but is it cheaper to go through an agency as opposed to hiring people at PPSD for these positions?
Good question.
I would say this, we would prefer to hire people to work for PPSD and join our staff. So we're not doing this to spend money differently or save money or spend more money. It's because we need people to fill these positions. As to what the cost breakdown is, I really can't speak to that. I don't know if Chris or Zach could. With a salary and fringe benefit for a PPSD employee versus what I sense, I don't wanna guess at that.
Probably varies a little bit by role, but
I
would definitely
don't
agree that
think
we
it
would.
would be significantly different, but I don't wanna be quoted on that.
I don't think it'll be any different. I think it's just the current need. They're not needing it to.
I think you'd re, like, the desire would always be to have those people hired
Correct.
as our employees.
Since it's a staffing agency, does this qualify under the TAP goal for world-class talent, even though they're not our district employees?
I would say so, yes.
Very good. Unless we have any other further questions or concerns, I would make a motion to approve with the edits noted on the contract, front page, as noted. Do I have a motion?
Yes, motion.
Second. So moved. Thank you. Moving right along, we'll jump into agenda item 4.6, the Learn Well contract with sole source consideration.
Also me. So this contract is for enabling us to provide educational services for students who are hospitalized at Bradley Hospital. At any given time, we have 4 to 15 students who are experiencing a significant mental health crisis and are hospitalized in a variety of Bradley Hospital programs across the state. We make every effort. We're also required to continue to provide educational services to those students. Bradley has contracted with Warrenwell to provide tutors in their hospital. We then pay LearnWell for the students that are Providence students that need educational services in Bradley, which is why we put this down as a sole source vendor. We have, as I said, an average of, we've had 4 to 15 students at any time hospitalized. There's an average of about 10 at any given time. 39, when we tracked the data, we had about 40 students total at that time, who had required these services. About half of them have IEPs, not all of them are students with disabilities, some of them are general education students. They typically access about 3 to 10 hours of tutoring services per week, but that does vary based on students. Learnwell charges us $35 per hour per student. So this is something that the district has not done before. It's been a new responsibility that we've identified. And so we have again kind of estimated needing up to $15,400 per month. I will be monitoring that over time to see how much really does need to be allocated.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, so in the, on the third page, it says Learnwell and it says monthly, and the amount is for 212,954.
Oh,
Is it different than the 154,000?
I apologize.
What's the correct amount then?
I'll have to double check that. I apologize for that.
And the other question, it's the amount that you're asking is for like the annual amount, right?
Correct.
Okay,
Well, through the end of June.
through the end of June.
Thank you, Dr. Connolly. Yeah, we would need clarification on that to approve this contract. One other notation, I do note here that it seems that the contract has already commenced back in October, and it's a new contract. So is this because it's a new partnership with that Cotwell Care as being done with the Bristol Warren School District as well, or is this, in its own form?
Can you repeat that?
So Bristol Warren Schools also has an innovative partnership with Bradley Hospital
Oh, this is
called Cotwell
different.
Care.
This is different.
This is different.
This is different. This was a service we became aware of that we needed to provide for these students. So it's something that we should have been doing for a longer period of time. It was flagged for us last year. We began working with Learnwell, really trying to identify how to begin this partnership. But ultimately, these students need to have educational services provided to them by the district. We also want to make sure that when they're ready to come back to school, they don't have a huge gap in their knowledge and being able to catch up with everything.
So is the length of contract going to be correct? Because it says on the paper that it's from like October of last year through June of this year.
That we began this work with them in October, and then I ended it on June 30th because that's the end of the fiscal year, so
Okay.
everything has to reset for July 1st.
So this amount is going to cover the past few months and the upcoming months.
That might be why there's two different amounts too.
No, I think there's two different amounts because I think you're working off one version, to be honest.
Okay, and I apologize for that, we checked this multiple times.
So, but we'll make sure you have the right.
The other question I had was.
I also don't have a historical basis on this, so that's part of the challenge as well,
The other question I have is the service provided by Learnwell in person or virtual?
in person, usually in person.
Okay.
Is what they're providing supplemental, like, so you said it's tutoring?
It's teachers,
So, sorry, go ahead.
so they provide the teachers, the schools have to send the work for the students to do during the hospitalization, but they provide the teachers to help support the work.
Right, so so their teachers aren't doing any kind of like hybrid, they're not doing any virtual with the students, it's just them giving the information to these teachers at Bradley, and then
Yes.
they're working with them
And
on it.
supporting the students completing their work while they're hospitalized.
Awesome.
I mean, this is highly variable. If the student's having and this is why it's very fluctuating. If the student's really having a difficult day, they might not be able to do their schoolwork.
Right,
Other days, they may be in a better place, they're able to complete it.
and then, I'm sorry, And so are these like on a, they're like more like on an on-call basis, right? So if a student ends up at Bradley, then they'll get called and come in. They're not on staff all the time at Bradley, right?
I'm pretty sure that they have the staff at Bradley on site because there's other districts across the state
That
that have
utilize
students at Bradley. So it's my understanding that the staff, the LearnWell staff are at Bradley, and then they bill us based on how many Providence students that we
When you
have.
serve them. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
They break the bills down by student and by amount of time that the students have been able to access their education.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Do you know if LearnWell has teachers that are bilingual, or is this only for English speaking students?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I know that Bradley does do translations for students that are hospitalized, but I can find that out.
I should have asked the same thing for the nurses too that provide other things. Because Providence has, a lot of non-English speakers, so.
One of the questions I have is regarding the accountability measures. It states the last sentence, the total expense is estimated based on enrollment for the first semester. Do we expect an actual amount for the second semester?
Again, that's my best
That's your
guess.
best estimate.
Because to date, we've had 4 to 15 students at any given time that are hospitalized at Bradley. Now that may change. Spring tends to be a very difficult time for mental health issues. We may see that double, it may decrease. I really don't know.
Thank you.
Do you know if the tutors or teachers that are being used for the services, are they certified as community mental health workers, or do they have any type of training with that? Or are they just regular teachers that are just hired to do this?
I think they're regular teachers because the kids are hospitalized, so they're at Bradley while they're getting this service. They're inpatient. These are for students that are inpatient at Bradley.
So they're housed there.
Correct.
Okay.
It could be, Bradley has hospitalizations where children stay in the hospital 24/7. So it could be those students. Bradley also has partial programs where kids come to the hospital for the day and spend the day getting mental health services. But Bradley would be the ones providing the mental health services. These are certified teachers that are helping the students keep up with their schoolwork.
And they provide services every day for those students that are there, or is it just like once a week, or?
I think they go every day.
And the students will have access to them as long as they need, or?
While they're hospitalized.
While they're hospitalized?
Once they're discharged, they'll come back to school.
There's no like hourly limit or something like that per student or anything?
They don't they're there to get intensive mental health services, so it's usually about an hour or two a day that they'll spend doing their schoolwork, because they're there to get, intensive therapy, medication adjustments. I mean, these are students that are really significantly struggling with their mental health. It's also why they may not be able to, one day they may get, a half hour, that's all they can tolerate. Other days, it's more. It really fluctuates.
Thank you.
I have another question, and I apologize if you already answered this, and you might have. I know you said that they get the services during hospitalization, but then there's also day programs. Would day programs constitute hospitalization?
Yes, it's
Okay.
considered a hospitalization. The
Okay,
kids kind of report to the hospital for a school day, but then they go home at night. But again, they're not coming to school, so we want to make sure that they're able to keep up with their schoolwork.
perfect, thank you.
So Dr. Connolly, Ms. Hughes noted that she online observed the total of $154,000
Yes.
does agree to the amount requested on the contract form on page 1. So I would be confident, I would like to see that dollar amount still filled in on a monthly basis, what that breakdown would be. my calculation had it over a little $17,000 per month. But if we can get that updated, I would feel confident, unless there's any other questions or concerns about this contract, I would feel confident about approving this with those updates for the next full school board meeting. Samina,
Motion to move.
I second.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. That concludes the reports on contracts. The next is discussion for the fiscal 24 and fiscal 25 budgetary forecast.
Thank you so much. So Zach Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Operations, here with Fiscal TC, our Executive Director of Finance. We're passing out our FY 24. So we'll do this two separate items, but you'll probably see some relationship between the current fiscal year, FY 24, as well as our projections ahead for next year, the fiscal year 25. So what you'll see, and I know there's a lot of information here, so maybe what we can do is I can kind of describe it, talk through some broad strokes, takeaways, and then give people some time to review and ask questions as we go through. But what you have is this is our budget and year-to-date revenue and expenses through end of quarter 2. So quarter 2 ends in December. So we take that information and then project through the remainder of the year to identify areas where we are either getting more revenue or less revenue, or have planned expenditure, or have expenditures that are tracking above or below our budget targets. So it's organized. The first page is revenue, and the following pages are all expenses, and they're organized by object code, which is what the state of Rhode Island prescribes in terms of budget reporting. Let me start with page 1, which is short but sweet. But complicated, even in its brevity. And so what you'll see here, and I know this is the first time with this composition of the board, so I'll spend extra time trying to explain what's here, but please ask questions as I'm going. On the revenue side, what you'll see are key sources of revenue on the local budget. And so that includes state aid is typically around 2/3 of our revenue, and the balance is largely city aid, which is that second line. And then there are also some smaller sources of fund, miscellaneous, indirect costs. So indirect costs is funds we receive from grants as part of overhead to cover those grants, and then Medicaid, where we reimburse for students services to students that qualify for Medicaid. What you'll note, pretty straightforward, is our state aid is tracking as planned. We are projecting slightly higher on miscellaneous and Medicaid. The biggest question mark is around city aid. So we are in mediation. We're no longer in mediation with the city, but we are in litigation about their contributions to the district under the Crowley Act. So under the Crowley Act, they're obligated to increase funding to the district at the same level that the state increases aid. So if the state increases aid by 2%, they are obligated to increase by 2%. However, we haven't, in each of the years of the intervention, not come to an agreement on that amount. What the city has contributed or has included in their budget was $130 million, and that is what we are at odds at in terms of mediation. So it is obviously a challenge to plan with that kind of moving target. So that's just something we've had to deal with, frankly, each year, and we're hopeful that there'll be a resolution that'll be beneficial to the citizens of Providence. So obviously a lot there. I'm happy to share some of the mediation. We can't share all the details of that as it's confidential, but I'd be happy to answer questions that folks have on the revenue before we then look at the expenditure side, which is a little bit more straightforward.
Why hasn't there been a clear agreement regarding the city aid?
Yeah, it's a good question. hard to know. I think there are probably some areas where there are grounds for interpretation, but I genuinely don't see. Yeah, I can't speak for the city about why they do it. I mean, there was the pandemic hit, and there were some challenges there that I think that state aid or they could speak to it more. We had a change in administration, which we've worked with the Allures administration on each of these years, and now we're working with the new administration. So some of it I think has to do with new changes in administration and not having that continuity. It is a challenge for the district for sure.
It appeared from what I researched that the city aid remained flat for a number of years. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
That's a correct interpretation.
That is accurate. And that's a challenge for us when you think as a district, if you just have small cost of living increases for our employees, the stuff we buy costs a little bit more, just say 2 or 3% each year, you would expect our funding sources to grow at that rate too. And the state aid has. The state aid is kept up. It's tied to enrollment, so as our enrollment changes or goes down, it goes down as well. But the city aid doesn't change where they're going. And actually, the aid you get for the city, and we'll share this because it actually lives in the expenditures, but the aid we get for the city is to cover not just students with PTSD, but any Providence student that attends a public charter school as well.
Has the state gone up every year for the last maybe 4, 5, 6 years?
It has been, I think, right? Was there any, when you look at all funding from the state?
State funding to education has increased
Every year? You don't know by what percentage?
Give me a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
I have it.
I have a question about, you said, Mr. Scott, that we were in mediation with the city and now in litigation. Is that a different situation than we were in previous years? Is that a new step? And if so, what kind of, so 2-part question, is that different? And then also now in litigation, I understand that can, that sort of elevates things. It's going to cost more in and of itself. And then also, what kind of timeline are we talking about for a resolution or hoped for resolution, I guess, to this dispute?
Yeah, so, and hopefully I won't get the years mixed, but it was last year, I believe, so where the commissioner took action and withheld funds, or directed the state treasurer to withhold funds from the state to the city. And those funds were held, we agreed to hold them in escrow, so rather than take them into the district, they were held in a separate account, and we entered into mediation with the city. And at that time, it was the Allures administration, it was the end of that administration. And through mediation, we were able to reach an agreement for fiscal years 21, 22, and 23. So similarly this year, when the increase was not provided, the commissioner directed the treasurer to withhold funds. The treasurer did that. I'm going to mess up the specific legal step that happened, but the city essentially filed an injunction claiming irreparable harm, which the judge ruled and said, yes, we think this might cause irreparable harm to the city because it would impact their ability to pay bills, which we can discuss the legitimacy of that argument. But so while they weren't able to withhold, the judge said, you need to enter into mediation and try to resolve this prior to the judge making a ruling on several funds, but one of which is what the amount of withholding should be. So we entered into mediation as directed by the judge. That began in the late fall. We had, I shouldn't know the exact number of times, but 5 or 6 times where we met with the city, went through that process. And while in the prior year we had reached an agreement, and this go around we did not reach an agreement, meaning we're going back in front of the judge in the coming months for him to make a ruling. Now it's a little bit unclear exactly how long that time will take because of appeals and things like that. In talking with counsel, it is likely more than 12 months. Now, at any point, the parties can go back into mediation, right? Like we can always choose to decide to come back, and so it's not that mediation is done, but we've had a pass at it, and we are going back in front of the judge.
So mediation's more like negotiation. between
Correct.
two
Yeah, you have a
parties.
mediator, appointed mediator that both sides agree upon. He or she then helps the sides kind of reach to see if there's an agreement, which happened last year but did not happen this year.
And how long did that take last year for those set negotiations to?
I mean, it was about, we were in mediation for about the same time we were in this year, just concluded with an agreement.
And so what happens in the meantime? It looks like we have been receiving some city aid to date. So is the idea that if this isn't resolved by the end of this fiscal year, that the city is going to only provide us with 130 million because that's what they put in their budget versus the 147.9 that we requested? Is that an accurate?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Mr. Patisi can share more
Well, that's
on this.
pretty.
But that's accurate. And then it becomes a bit of an accounting thing. So like we would still on our books show what we believe the city owes us. We wouldn't have had the cash that comes in, but it would essentially be, it's not what it's called, but like an IOU is actually
A bill due.
a bill due to the city saying like, you owe us this delta. And listen, and we can talk through some of the expenditures. We're trying to make sure we advocate and plan for what we had in our budget, what we think is best for students and what we think is owed. We also don't want to put the district in a position where we are spending money where it may not come to fruition. So we tried to strike that balance between, for lack of a better term, we don't want to solve the city's problem for them and say like, cut everything and just spend 130 million, but we also need to have some plans in case things are. And we can talk a little bit more about that because there's the revenue question, and then I can talk through some of the expenditure side, which is a little bit more, well, a lot more lengthy, a little more straightforward, I think. So if I can turn to that, please go ahead.
No, I wanted to answer your state funding education percentage change.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to changes from fiscal year 15 to 16 was a 4.4% increase.
So, but that's the overall state or it's PPSD?
State aids from education overall.
Okay. Do you have were you looking at the state or the PPSD?
PPSD specific.
Sure. So the state funded PPSD is a 3.69 increase from 15-16 to 16-17 was 5.45 increase. From 17 to 18 was 6.47 increase. 18 to 19 was a 1.98. We don't go too fast. 19-20 was a 3.98% increase. 20 to 21, 3.2. 21 to 22, 1.76. And 22 to 23, 0.32%. 23 to 24, 1.78% increase. A lot of that has to do with obviously more chips in the room as well.
Thank you.
So go through expenditures.
I had one
Please,
question
yeah.
about the miscellaneous projected interest earned.
Yeah.
That looks pretty significant, $405,000.
Yeah, so a lot of it isn't all earned interest. A lot of it too has to do with a lot of our students. So in that line item of miscellaneous, a lot of our students are out to CTE programs. We collect revenue from those LEAs. A lot of sometimes it could be a reimbursement from other expenditures that we had that came in late, so on and so forth. But a lot of it has to do with the city has changed the way they're doing their banking, and the interest rates have increased at the Citizens Bank, if you will. So we're seeing more of a projected increase in the money that's in our bank. Yep.
So the next section are organized, and what do you think? So each line is an object code, and because the technical salaries benefits are
Grouped in service categories, categories, supplies, services, benefits.
So what you'll see are salaries, benefits, services, supplies,
Capital and utilities.
I'll go through each of them in broad strokes, but then I'll let folks time to review and you can certainly ask questions. So numbers in in black mean we are projecting to a surplus, so that we've underspent. Red is that we're projecting an overspend. So it's usually worth looking at the salaries line altogether, because oftentimes when you have underspending on salaries, you might be overspending on you might be spending more on overtime because you have more staff. So what you'll note here, the big takeaway is that we are projecting to spend under on salaries this year. It kind of dovetails a little bit with what we were talking about with Dr. Connolly due to vacancies that we have, not just in teaching positions, but other positions across the district. So obviously a good financial development, though we do not like having vacancies in our school. But that is an area of potential savings. And 4 million, obviously a very big number in absolute terms, but when you look across that total line, it's roughly 2%, 2% variance from the total budget there. Similarly, we are trending better on benefits. Some of that has to do with both, the staff composition, but we also have, not to complicate things, but this is our local budget. So anytime we are paying benefits for people who are charged to a grant, that doesn't necessarily live here, so that can lead to some savings here. So salaries and benefits together are running fairly good in terms of a surplus or a deficit. Services spans a wide range of different things. It includes a number of our large service contracts. You'll see kind of small numbers where I'll direct your attention, but you can certainly try to ask questions anywhere you'd like. But towards the bottom of the second page, I'll highlight a few of where we're seeing some potential overages. Moving and rigging. This has to do with a lot of the moves we did at the start of the summer as we transitioned to three of our new schools. I think I don't know if we shared it with this group, but we did with the prior finance committee. Part of that was the most recent projects that were completed did not include moving in the capital project, the capital budget, but those future projects do. Which is good because these should be reimbursable expenses, but these were kind of had to be borne by the district for these first three projects. Transportation, and it's actually it actually falls in line with where you see the tuition line. We are seeing a significant increase in the added number of students that are placed out of district for special education services. That's both due to increased student need, but also vacancies in our special education areas. And when we place students out of district, we have to pay tuition. So you see that tuition line of 4.9 million projected overage. But it also impacts our transportation number. So I think our general transportation number is probably closer to what we had projected. It's the portion that serves out of district placements that we're seeing. So those, and that'll come up as we talk about our fiscal year 25 planning, is that this out of district placement is becoming an increasing amount of spend for the district. And so we think we are more appropriately capturing this kind of new reality that we're in for next year. But for this year, we are seeing it as an overage against our budget.
Regarding the salaries,
Please.
Does the surplus have to do with like the closure of some of the schools?
No, so this is all the current fiscal year. So these were positions that were planned for this year that have not been filled. So that it is just because of the vacancies we have in positions for this year. So it's nothing to do with the school closure. When we see reductions from our budget from this year to next year, that would have to do with if we are reducing the number of positions.
Okay.
From one year to the next.
The laborers' pensions and benefits,
Yep.
the benefits category shows an expected $100,000 overrun. Is that because of the increase of benefits packages, or pension?
So that's,
deficit?
yeah, so that line is specific to members that are in the 1033 bargaining unit, not city
retirement as a whole.
So teacher assistants, childcare workers,
Bus
OT.
monitors,
Yeah.
crossing guards, OTs, PTs, childcare workers. Yeah, so that's the way it was currently trending in December.
I'm trying to think what else stands out. Yeah, some of the supplies, so it is worth mentioning, we did, because of some of the challenges and the revenue uncertainty, we did enact a spending freeze and hiring freeze for non-essential items. And so that's where you're starting, in these projections, we'll start to see, like on the supply line, we're projecting some savings there, and that's in part because we stopped, schools need
Copy paper.
yeah, all that stuff. It still will go on, but for more discretionary spending, that's where we held on.
With such an uncertainty on the revenue side, we have to take mitigation steps.
That's difficult to
Um,
do.
Can you give examples of non-essential items?
Not essential items.
Yeah, so we've had somewhere like, hey, I have 5 Chromebooks that broke and I need to replace them. Essential. Hey, I've got extra money in this line that I thought I had to use for this. Can I buy extra Chromebooks to stock up? We might say no, like not if you need it to run your day-to-day operations, but if you have extra money and supplies, we wouldn't allow that kind of discretionary purchase because it's not a bad idea. It's just not something we have the luxury to do.
So if a school had their budget, the budget's been approved from last, because they did it last year, so it got approved. So and then we have this freeze. So does that mean that the money in that budget is no longer there? It's no longer accessible?
It's essentially frozen. Yeah, I mean, if things were to improve and we were to release it, they could open it. But what we're doing is we're freezing it so that if we have to close this revenue shortfall that we have funding available to do that.
So how does that affect the schools in terms of like planning for things? So for example, stepping up, right? So how can a school plan for that if they don't know whether or not they're going to get approved the funding for it?
We've tried to be thoughtful with, so like you're talking about the graduation ceremony. I think what we'll do is in case like that, we'll work with the transformation officer, the school supervisor to understand. Like, I think we would, like, there've been parent engagement events that we've allowed, we've had move forward. I would assume we would cover like graduation events. It might just not be at the same scale that we would want it to before.
So do you think?
But I don't want to sugarcoat it. Like school, it is a challenge for schools. Like they had planned for this, and now they have to either scale it back or do something. So it's not ideal.
So this freeze essentially is hindering parent engagement.
We tried to do our best for like we took school said, hey, I've got a parent engagement night planned for the next few months. Those were allowed to continue, and oftentimes it might be using like Title I funds, so those have been allowed.
Ones that are already planned before the freeze. So anything after the freeze is up in the air or likely to not be.
They'd probably be approved on a case-by-case basis.
How long is the time? So what is the time frame for that? So if a school wants to have an event, right, for the families and they give you a rec, what's the time frame to get an answer on that?
We try to be, are you meeting with TOs weekly to remove the kind of one-off?
Weekly?
Yeah.
What are some examples of miscellaneous services? It's on the third page.
This is at the monitoring like
And then I know like the amount of
Raleigh and
we don't track for that one, there's like nothing there, there's no deficit or surplus for that.
Yeah, so right now there's a planned expenses of $720,000. the budget was 700.
Okay.
That we expect to fully utilize the 790,000.
As of December 30th, yeah.
So this is December
Yeah, quarter two.
2023.
What do we do? What exactly is miscellaneous services for?
I'll give you the exact items that are in there. One second.
Sorry, is the note on this page near miscellaneous services, the air monitoring?
That's for the-
That's for the health and services.
Oh, that's the health services? Okay.
The,
Health service providers.
Can you talk more about what that is?
Yeah.
The air, I'm sorry, so the air monitoring services is miscellaneous services. The health service providers was part of some of the maximum contract that Dr. Conley was talking about earlier, that has a zero budget, because those would be employees, so there's no budget for them in the services contract. So that's why I say that's the $245,000. The note for the air monitoring services is part of the $790,000 that does the monitoring services at Springfield Complex, Alvarez, so on and so forth. So it's like the services that are.
So we've had an increase in spend in Alvarez given the monitoring earlier this year, and so it's, I think,
Well, your
flagged.
quality, is that what you?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was flagged for, this is one of those areas, it's a little bit of a gray zone in terms of is it a district
CPFC?
responsibility or the city responsibility?
That's why I haven't, yeah, that's why.
Paying it, and we'll need to receive reimbursement for the additional costs we've incurred this year. So in total, we're on the expense side, we have about largely by the district placement and transportation, about a $2 million pressure. Again, we're hopeful that some of the mitigation steps we've taken will address that, and obviously keep monitoring city contribution for the current fiscal year.
I have another question.
Please.
So you were talking about Title I money, can you not freeze Title I money?
We've done that, we've frozen non-discretionary money in Title I as well.
So Title
It's local dollars are a lot more flexible, so oftentimes those are easier to freeze in Title I. They can expire at a certain point, you can only carry over so many.
That's federal, right?
Correct.
You can freeze federal money, you can freeze federal funds.
Yeah, you have to be careful of the dollar amount that you have to carry over to the next fiscal year. It's a cap on dollar amount that you can carry over. Because if there wasn't, then the Fed would say, I'm not giving you the money anymore because you're not spending it.
Right, right.
And we also have expenditures that are currently on local dollars that you could apply to Title I that are Title I eligible if we needed to cover revenue issues in our local budget. Again, not ideal and not what we would normally want to do.
No, those funds are intended.
So if you, I'm sorry, because I'm confused. So if you freeze Title I money, how can you utilize it so that you get the money next year?
Sometimes it can be carried over, or we might have expenditures.
But if it's carried over, you'll get less next year, right?
Not
From
necessarily.
the federal government?
More often that we have expenditures that are in our local budget that are Title I that you could cover, that you could use Title I dollars to cover.
A school
So like
could have,
Ron Peter to pay ball.
correct, yeah, a school could have budgeted an after-school program in both places, in local budget and in Title I, depending on how they split the activities, but the activity could be totally Title I eligible. So to Zach, what Zach was saying is that we potentially could move those expenditures that happened in local, and move it into Title I. So we have to be mindful of all of our spending pots to help balance this large shortfall that we're experiencing. So to your point, yeah, Rob, be a big fault.
So is the freezing, so is this being done to adjust this year's budget or because of next year's budget?
This year's budget. That's what we're doing. That's the freeze in large part because of some of it has to do with the higher than expected expenditures on out-of-district placement, but frankly, a lot of it has to do with revenue uncertainty from the city, right? So if we were anticipating 147 million, they put it at 130 million. Yeah, when it became more and more clear that that wasn't going to happen, that required us to reduce some expenditures just in the event. You know, we're assuming we're not going to receive the full amounts, but we don't know yet now the amount we'll receive.
Also, I mean, just to complicate things too, there's also a cash flow issue, right? So you can't spend money that you don't have, and the school department doesn't have the ability to raise cash or borrow money. So we have to be mindful of, if we're not going to get X amount of dollars from the city, we can't deplete all of our bank account because we don't have money to pay our bills. It's all part of it, big picture.
So they're operating very delicately and.
Yeah.
being tricky
And
about it.
unfortunately, it's just the situation that we're in.
And lastly, what I'll say is, I mean, obviously we've had some disagreements with the city over the years. I think, but the challenge is becoming very real for us, and I'm sure very real for the city is the because it grows. You know, the city stays at 130 each year, and our budget grows as the Caliac, says they should increase it each year. Like the gap is getting bigger and bigger, where it's easier to deal with a couple
smaller
$1 million
increases every year instead of a large bill of the.
Is there a way that you can, provide, so, all right, let me just try to say what's going on in my head. My concern as a parent is that schools are scared, right? And they're not gonna waste time trying to provide events, engagement, or anything, because they're gonna assume it's gonna be denied. There is the freeze, they're worried that it's gonna take away from something else, right? So is there some way where, God, I don't know how to say what I'm saying. Is there a way where you could provide them with like limits, right? Or like what can they do? What has a good chance of, right? Or what has a good chance of being approved? Or what can they access? Like,
yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
We gave, and we can share with this group a FAQ document to principals saying like, hey, here's the clear black and white, like, yep, no worries, keep doing this. You got an after school tutoring program, like keep doing that. We're not gonna, you don't have to relitigate that. And trying to think of, I don't know, a good example, like,
Field trips.
I wanna, me and my, people actually do this, but like, me and my admin team, we're gonna go to a big conference out of our local budget. Like, nope, can't do that. That's a no. And then the process there's gonna be some gray areas about like, that probably takes some judgment, not just, frankly, not finances judgment, but the principal supervisor of those school, where we have the weekly kind of review of recs to say, is this required? Is this a
Emergency student facing. We've approved and the FAQ to say anything that was student facing that would increase student achievement is to continue on throughout the rest of the school year.
So we try to give them guidance so it was clear, so they didn't have to your point, like think it through every purchase and whether like we tried to make it clear, knowing that there's gonna be some gray area that we'll need to review.
And is that different for the schools that are closing? Does it look different?
No.
I think I would just echo Aubrey's concern from the parent perspective that I think springtime tends to be when there are more events, and I think especially those graduation or moving up or whatever, I know they're called different things at different levels, but sort of that moving on from one school to the next. And I know for some schools, for one in particular, that this is the last year that that school is going to be in use for a little while until there's a major renovation. And we know that we have some other schools that are closing or merging or doing other things. And so I might advocate to say, to be explicit with those communities and with all of our communities that, you know, you need to decide that, but I would recommend as a parent who's worked with parents from across the district for a long time, that could go a long way as, and count to me, my understanding of student facing, right? It's celebrating students, it's celebrating families, it's honoring folks' experiences with their schools and, you know, not to go bananas and extravagant on everything, but making sure that that's explicit because this is the time when schools would be planning those end of year gatherings, either for the students that are moving up and or, you know, sometimes there's a, you know, again, I don't want to, we can't promise every single thing, but considering ways to prioritize those community engagement opportunities, school community engagement opportunities for students and families, because there are lots of cuts and I, you know, we're talking about this year's budget. Like this is already stinky for this year and like we're looking at next year and that's likely to be even more grim than this. And so I think not underestimating the power of those ways for folks to connect. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
I agree. Recognition is important for students, especially this time of year, for parents, which is so important. So I think that's a great, you know, recommendation to provide us some type of an overview of what's allowed, what's not allowed, and try to take a deeper dive into how we can be, you know, somewhat creative and not, you know, going overboard with some of these events, but still giving the proper due recognition for student events. I think that's very, very important. So.
And I'm gonna piggyback and say that in terms of the schools that are closing, they already feel shorted. They already feel that the energy is bad, right? The feeling is bad. And to couple that with the fact that there's no access to money for some kind of celebratory something, some kind of event something is will create a lot of anger, a lot of tension, a lot of distrust or more, right? More distrust. And I think even little things are important at this point, and I feel like not allowing that is really detrimental to everyone involved, right? To the students, to the parents, to the staff, especially, you know, to the community, to everyone involved. Like it's, I know, so, right, my daughter goes to Gilbert, and I'm in the school and I know the energy there, and I know that they want to try to do things for these kids. It's the last year of school and their hands are tied and they don't know where they're going. The teachers don't know where they're going. The staff doesn't know. The students are confused. Parents are upset. There's a feeling of less than, right? It's a feeling like people like wash their hands of them, right? And then to not have anything for them or to not be able to do something to celebrate them or something positive within the school, I feel like is really detrimental. So I feel like I would just like y'all to consider that.
Certainly, yeah, and you know, we want to maintain an open dialogue. If there are things that people are feeling they can't do that. I mean, again, not to sugarcoat it, there are things that we just won't be able to do. But I hear you, particularly with the schools that are closing. And my respectful request is just, you know, to the extent you're speaking with others about, you know, the contributions due to the school district in terms of what the city is obligated to provide, and you know, not to listen. It doesn't benefit anyone to point fingers, but it also like we are put in a difficult position in part because of on our, by our estimation, failure to meet the obligation under not only what's adequate for kids, but what's obligated under the law. So, but heard on the.
I know you mentioned the transportation.
Yep.
It does look like a significant overrun there, and is that because of, as you described, the transportation to the other school districts and charter schools and
Yeah, not charter. We don't do we wouldn't do charter schools.
price of
So no,
gas and
so a lot of those, a lot of those students that are in the special ed outplacements take statewide transportation. So we're seeing obviously we're seeing a large number of those students go to those placements, get transported through statewide transportation. So we're seeing significant overages and those number of students riding those buses, but we're seeing some offsets in our buses, so that's many of
There's specific learning, there's specific out of district sites that have a significant amount of our students, like Ocean State Learning Center, right? So that is our transportation department is covering those buses, and the increase of those students, because they come from all different parts of the city, the number of buses that are, being allocated to that one site in North Providence is significantly higher than previous years.
Does transportation also, like Adams district transportation, does that also include kids that are homeless, or not homeless rather, homeless, displaced,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Or ones that moved at a certain point during the year and have to be,
We're legally obligated to transport.
right, yeah.
So
And the other question I had on the indirect costs of water shows a $15,000 overrun. And the other utilities seem a savings. Why the water? Is it increase for the buildings?
yeah, I haven't dug deep into see why. I mean, that's just the way the expenditures were trending. And obviously bad word, but sewer was trending to better. I mean, definitely.
Thank you.
A lot of it has to do with fire suppression and those things too, so. Yeah.
The buildings is more fire.
What's that? Oh, yes, I left the faucet running now.
Very good.
I mean, we did renovate all of our, bottle filler stations at every school, so that incentivizes students to access it and service that. So hopefully they're drinking more water, which is cleaner water.
Any other questions?
I just break it. We want to go through FY25 too, so it's late.
We do a speed round.
I'd like to get an overview of it.
Yeah, please, we're more than happy to. I just saw this back up and
We might
Kevin
as
fills the
well,
mood like another.
get right to it.
So now the good news.
We're in this mode, right,
Do you have one more copy of this?
I wrote on mine, but I think it's
Just for a second?
yeah, just a little bit.
Just gonna use away. Got some PTC
Artwork.
Artwork.
and then
This should be.
I think we have.
Yeah.
this. Do we have another copy of the projected FY25?
This one's
It is a clean copy.
That's a clean.
I gotta scribble on mine, so I'll keep that one. I'll add scribbles to it. Thank you.
All right, so now we're talking about the next fiscal year. So obviously different types of projections. And again, we're typically, in the past few years, at least, we've done an update in April and an update in May, but we wanted to come in front of you, just given how, as we've been sharing, complicated it is. So slide 2 just, again, frames that. Typically, we'll be back in April to do a little bit of a revision of what you'll see here. And then in May, and we have a timeline in the back of the slide deck, where you get a detailed like budget book and all that. It happens in May. That we try to sync with the city's timeline as we normally do. So first section, we'll go over budget overview before some detailed projections. So again, to orient us on slide 4, I think we were last with the board, the full board in December to talk through some of the early budget projections. And so what you'll see here are some finer projections, some of the estimated impacts we have for different decisions, even though they're all frankly in draft before we finalize our budget in the late spring. We look at slide 5. I'll spend a minute on this because it's our second year of doing student-based budgeting, and I think this is the right direction to head for the district, and I'll explain why. But really, the goals of student-based budget are to increase equity and to differentiate resources to school based on need. Also ensuring that the way funds are allocated are transparent and predictable, and that decisions can be made at the school level and aligned with district strategy. So to give you kind of a very high level of how it works, and then I'll juxtapose it with how kind of our old methodology was. We'll, each student, we allocate funds per student, and then students with different needs, whether they might be multilingual learners, differently abled students, students experiencing poverty, students at high schools, students in CTE programs, knowing that it takes different costs and supports for all of our students. Each student has an additional weight associated with them. That then leads to a pot of money that's allocated to schools based on the number of students and the needs of those students. So schools with more students will receive more funding. Schools that have students with higher needs will receive more funding on a per pupil basis. And I mean, it makes sense, but it's different from how we've done things historically. So historically, largely what would happen is the central office would allocate staff and say, you get 10 teachers, 2 clerks, an assistant principal, and a principal. Here's roughly 3% of that overall budget that you get to spend on non-personnel, but less discretion around how personnel or things are done at the school. With this, there's a lot more discretion, though certainly like to run a school, if you have 2 second-grade classrooms as a principal, you're going to need to fund those positions. So it's not that it's, people still have basic compliance they need to meet, but it means more discretion. And let me give you some practical examples of why we did that. But oftentimes you would look at 2 schools and they might have the same number of students, roughly the same population of students, but that school would have 3 clerks and this school would have 2 clerks. And there wasn't always a real clear rationale aside from 5 years ago that school was a lot bigger and its enrollment declined, and so over time you get these inequities that would just build up because there wasn't a mechanism for really reassessing as either student need increase or enrollment change. So it can make things more challenging for principals because they have more decision-making authority, and it can lead to some tough decisions, but we feel like it allows them to allocate funds more equitably. Please.
So is this new, or have we already started doing this with the school district?
Year 2. So last year we, it's a good question. So in last fall and winter was our first year of doing student-based budgeting for our allocations for this year. So schools, when they built their budget last year, was using student-based budgeting. That is for the budget that they have in place for this year. The process we went through for this year is for what they used to build their budget for the following year. So typically we share enrollment projections and allocations in December, and then work with those schools in January, February, and March to build their budget staffing plans. And there can be changes that happen later on if things, revenue increases or enrollment changes.
So since the funding is going to follow the students and it's based on needs, does that mean the schools that have more students, for example, IEPs or something like that, they're going to be getting more funding? Because if you have, 20 kids that have IEPs and you get certain funding for that, it's going to be equivalent to what, maybe 60 kids that don't have IEPs. So how do we make sure that we distribute this in a way that schools are not going to be preferring to have kids with IEPs because they're going to get more money because of these kids than other kids?
Well, a couple of things. I think fundamentally we do want to encourage schools to take our the students that need the most. We want to incentivize schools to take students with high needs. Like we think that's a good. We don't want to put incentives in place that people say I don't want to take students with IEPs or multiple learners because that's bad, but also not what we want to do. But also the way that the funding formula works, it aligns the weights aligned to kind of the cost to educate a student. So let me give you an example. Students with in special education classrooms typically have smaller class sizes, right? So a full classroom typically has 20 to 25 students. Many of our highly specialized classrooms only have 10 students in it, right? So we do need to allocate more funds per student because it takes only you only need 10 students to kind of fund a full teacher versus for a classroom of 20, 25, it's not as costly per student. So the funding really has to match what it costs to educate.
I'm just looking at this from various perspectives. I mean, there's all this work being done with, for example, diversity, inclusion, and all this stuff, and it just looks like, this is gonna. It doesn't seem that there's a lot of equality or equity in the sense of the students. For example, it's gonna be preferred for. It's almost like we're not looking at
The school still has to do the conversation.
Yeah, I would actually push a little bit. To me, this is actually far more equitable than the old way of doing it. And here's why. So you might have two schools historically that have maybe it's made up of 100 students each, right? This one school has 30% special education, 20% multilingual learners. This has 10% multilingual learners. I would argue you want to give more funds to the school that has students with higher needs, whereas we might not have seen that in the old model. So I actually think it's equitable in the sense that we're providing more resources to schools and students that have higher needs.
But it just seems like we're not incentivizing those schools and students that are not needing certain services. So it's gonna be then what's the point of me even going, for example, to a Providence school? Maybe looking into a charter school where.
I gotcha. Yeah, I mean, obviously we need to create a model that doesn't just say we're going to funnel all this money to these schools and these schools can't operate.
Because I'm thinking of parents looking at this or looking at the budget in the future or the reports, looking at I have 2 kids. It's like me saying, I know you're an honor roll student, you're doing great, but we're gonna spend more money on this child. So I don't know. It's just.
But the reality is, we do spend more. Whether we allocate it or not, our special education classrooms they do cost a lot more money to run.
No, of course, but that's what I'm saying. For example, even something as simple as the 360 school, they had more students that maybe speak that English as second language or this one. That would have been a school that would probably gotten more funding for per student because of the needs of the students in that school. In comparison to, that's just an example. So I'm just looking at it what's going to happen with schools that don't have the same amount of kids with
I know what you're saying. Can I?
Yeah.
So I think what he's saying is, how do you keep it equal in terms of funding? How do you keep the school set up for success, right? So how this school that may not have as many special needs students, right, or students that would have more money attached to them, and so how does this school stay above water when they don't have that amount of money? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah.
And then the parents will say, well, I'll send my kid to charter school, they'll have more specializations, and that's.
Yeah, so I will say every student comes with the same base weight, regardless of needs, and then those with additional needs have more funds that go on top of that. I will say we do have a process called a soft landing if we think there's a school that can't meet their minimum viability, but oftentimes that's for a school that is severely under-enrolled or very, very small. Larger schools typically have the funds. Like it hasn't been the case where people aren't able to fund core programs or basic programs because of it. I mean, I don't want to, it's hard to disentangle this, but because this year has been challenging, the next fiscal year has been challenging, it has meant less money going to schools than we had this past year. That's not because of student-based budgeting necessarily, but because we have to make reductions due to expected reductions in revenue for next year.
May I add a comment? Mr. Nina and Ms. Johnson, I hear what you're getting at with that. I think my experience from the parent end of like understanding how school budgets work, which I have to admit is pretty minimal because parents are not engaged enough in that budgeting process, which is a totally separate question. To that point, I think this process actually allows for better community engagement in the budgeting because more decisions are made at the school level. And so eventually, when this process gets better, I think that it'll allow communities to decide together like what things are a higher priority for them. And that may be very unique to each, that's going to be different at high school, middle, elementary, but it's also going to be really different, at classical to JSAC or from Leviton to Gregorian. Like those are not going to have, like both the students are different, the staff is different, like everything about that community is unique. And that's something that keeps coming out to us, I think, down the board. As folks come to us with unrest, I think often that's coming from feeling like their community isn't being seen and heard.
Yeah.
And so I do think that this process versus the old process, which was extremely top down from the district sort of pushing like, here's the money that you get, but you have to use 97% of it for these exact things. And here's this little tiny bit that you can play around with. So I think that that allows a little bit more. The other piece that I know you touched on, Zach, but I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more too. I recall from like many moons ago, like in a PTO role at certain schools, just that this is focused on trying to provide the amount of money that each student needs to get the education that they need. And the old model was about, we have a building that can fit 400 people in it, and so we're going to staff it like 400 people are always going to be in there, and it's going to be the same breakdown of 350 people that need X and 50 people need Y without like that ability to re-examine over time. Like maybe now the school only has 350 kids in total. I think that there's just more, but I think it's such a new process and is happening at such a weird time in our funding and unpredictable time that it's spilling out into like a complicated way of trying to roll it out. And I will also provide feedback that I think because it's so new that a lot of our teachers and staff and definitely families and community members don't fully understand both what it's supposed to be doing and how it actually is right now. Like I think there's I think folks aren't totally clear on it yet. And so it's still a learning process. And I'm gonna, no offense to all of you experts, but I'm gonna wager a guess that like it's also a learning process for the district as well, because it's completely different. Like I know Mr. Pedisi was telling us that he's been with PBSD in this department for a very long time, and we're lucky to have his years of expertise, but it's a complete mind shift of how folks do it. And I think there's definitely a discomfort there, but
Folks don't like changing it, so.
no one likes change. Change is uncomfortable, but I want to honor to say, I think Chairwoman Aiken asked earlier during one of our contract discussions about how does this relate back to the TAP and world-class talent, and I would say that shifting to this process really honors the commitment of both engagement, but also around efficient systems. And I think more broadly at the district's commitment to equity overall. But that doesn't mean it's perfect how it's working right now, and that there aren't sort of these repercussions like you're touching on, that these sort of unintended consequences, right, of like putting the money that way.
I do like the school empowerment and flexibility as outlined, and the equity piece is number one component of the goals. So, I think I have to agree with Ms. Hughes that that is, I think it's, something that we'll have to grow into as we get, more comfortable with the inner workings of this new budgeting process.
And it's 100% true that it's a learning curve for everyone. I mean, that's included.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you think of a school leader, right, like they're rightfully focused on instruction. And so this does require you to think differently about budgeting. And I bet if you polled our principals, a third love this. A third are like, yeah, it's all right. I'll get through it. Then a third are like, man, this is not what I like
Not what I
to do.
signed up for.
And that's fine. Like, we'll work with those folks to get them there. And oftentimes it's finding that person in your building who can support you and do this work too. But if you can imagine like understanding how this all works and then being able to engage your community about it is like, that's where we still need to build our own muscles and our principals' muscles on, like, now that you have this, like, even just making these complicated decisions and then how you engage appropriately on it is not easy.
Also gets the school year to think about all their funding resources and channels and how to relate all of those together to accomplish the ultimate goal at the school level. So it gets them thinking on different levels as well, to use all those fundings together.
I have a question. Is there anything in place like protective measures? So what I mean by that, I mean on a school and a district level. So on a school level, is there anything in place to protect or to prevent, right, principals from manipulating the system, letting the ego get the best of them, et cetera, right? And on a district level, is there anything put in place to protect from someone in the district deciding, well, I don't want the school open next year, this is the one we're going to close, so what we're going to do is we're going to distribute students this way, setting them up to fail, essentially, right?
So the first part is I was checking because this was the room where we had all our budget meetings with principals, and it would be representatives from special education, multilingual learners, principal supervisors. So it was almost like something like mission control, right? Like you have special education saying like, did they meet all did they have enough staff to make sure we're meeting our compliance? Like, yep. And then you had all those people around them to check for basic compliance. And then you have a principal supervisor saying, let's look at your improvement plan and how the investments you're choosing to make, or if you have to make a reduction, are you doing it? Like, are you sure not to knock any particular role, but like, are you sure you need that extra clerk? How about instead you use it for, like having those conversations to make sure that principals are, it is, we want to give them autonomy, but we also want to have some checks and balances.
Right.
On the latter part, like I think what makes this transparent is it's based on the number of students that are in your school. So,
but so when I'm sorry to cut you off, but that's kind of my point. So right now, so the time that the budget is being done is the same time school choice is happening. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if it's based on the amount of students in a school, that can be manipulated. I'm not saying you're all doing that, but I'm saying like the maniacal person in me that's where I'm going, right?
So I can share a little bit about how. So you have to do enrollment projections to do this as well. So and those start in the fall. Typically, what we'll do is we'll look at the number of students in each grade, enroll them up to the next grade. We know, for example, that over the course of the year we gain multilingual learners, and we often lose regular education students. We know we lose students at 4th and 5th grade because of charter. So we have to make some. Based on historical numbers, we apply those to schools, and we do that across the board. And then we look at kind of school choice from the prior years to know like when we have to allocate number of seats for 9th grade, where people go. So we then review those with principals who can push back and say like this doesn't align with what we want. But we have to take all that data to make those projections for the following year. And I like to think we have enough checks and balances in place to know kind of like manipulate those in a way that are to some, important.
That's good. We haven't even got into the numbers yet.
Yeah. So let me move you to slide 7, and there's a lot here. But this is the initial revenue projection for next year. So what you'll see is line. Let me go very slowly from left to right. So the left is our current fiscal year FY24 budget. What you'll note there is there's the enacted aid, and I believe that is the enacted aid from the prior year. Yeah, plus some reduction in the funding formula because we had less students. But the state provided this enrollment loss transition fund of 8.1 million. And so there are some smaller categorical funds for special ed and group home aid. That led to a total of 272 million roughly in unrestricted state aid. Below that is our other funding sources. So this will look familiar from what we just went through. You'll see our city aid with the asterisk at 147, Medicaid, indirect, and miscellaneous costs at totaling 156. So a total local budget of 428.6 million for FY24. There's some other funding sources, and we'll talk about them because they are becoming, well, one is becoming an increasingly large part of our budget. So non-public transportation offset is relatively small. But EL categorical funds typically in prior years had been in the range of $2 to $3 to $4 million. And this past year was for current fiscal year FY24 was increased to $9 million. I will just share with you. Obviously, more funding is good. It is when money is removed from the funding formula and put into categorical, it becomes a little more challenging because it has more restricted uses, and frankly, the funding formula, in our opinion, should factor in multilingual learner needs. It doesn't, but categorical is a way that the state has increased funding to the district, even while the funding formula has led to less aid. So the first line, you'll see Olin, our local budget's 428 million plus this additional roughly 10.4 million in restricted aid. So let me then walk you left to right. The next line is what we call governor requested. That is going to look identical from city aid. No, I'll take that back. Let me walk through line by line. So what you'll see here is the governor's requested budget for the current fiscal year. And what you'll see is it has a $10 million reduction in the funding formula. Though, am I saying this right? So enacted aid is roughly $262 million. The funding formula, which is the net with the 273 and 11. Oh, right. So the 273 minus the 11 you see there yields the funding formula of 262. We then are receiving seeing a $10 million reduction in enacted aid, but there's this enrollment loss transition fund that counteracts that. The high cost special ed and group home aid are roughly the same, so that yields are about a $8 million decrease in state aid in unrestricted straight aid to the district. In this version, it assumes city aid stays flat. Our Medicaid goes back down a little bit to what it had been historically. But you'll see the kind of subtotal for city Medicaid indirect costs and miscellaneous is down slightly by roughly $2 million. So that yields altogether roughly $10 million decrease in local aid. However, what you'll note is that ELL categorical funds have increased, are projected to, are in the governor's budget, are projected to go up by 7.6 million, which helps to soften some of the blow. But again, in restricted aid, not in total state aid. That change column is the difference between the two. So you'll see kind of where that difference is again, roughly $8 million decrease in state aid, $2 million decrease attributed to Medicaid and indirect, and then an increase in ELL category. Any questions there?
In terms of fees, and the district anticipates total
of $8 million and the funding formula decreasing. When do we expect the funding formula to be finalized?
When the General Assembly votes in June.
So there's, I'm sorry, so there's two, yes.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So there's two pieces of, actually three pieces of state aid. First piece, which is the government's request, is based on October enrollment plus any puts and takes for charter expansion. Ryan gives those numbers to Department of Revenue, give it to the budget, so the budget. The government puts that forth to its government budget, that's why we call it the government's budget. Second piece is going to be a March data update, where some of your enrollment projections get finalized, because obviously you'll have some growth from October to March, hopefully in the district. And some of those charter expansions may or may not happen, and we're planning for and may not get approved. So that's the second piece of which we'll be knowing in the next couple of weeks what our March changes will be for projected state aid. Then it's all contingent upon General Assembly vote, exact same, which is June. So we know that they can't touch funding formula piece. However, that's why you'll see the big increase in categorical, which is not enacted in state law, which the General Assembly could be.
And there are some discussions about changes to the funding formula. While they can't touch it, they did this year cap the amount that it could grow on a per student basis. And that's been a topic of conversation among superintendents with some concerns about the impact of that.
Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you very much so, thank you
It's complicated.
very much. Can you elaborate a little more when you talk about the categorical funding for the ELL, $7.6 million? Can you talk about, you mentioned restricted aid along with that. Can you help me understand why that's restricted?
I mean, I could stop.
Yeah, we need to put, it requires an application, so we need to say we're gonna use it to fund these sources. We typically use it to fund some of our multilingual learner classrooms as well as coaches. So on the one hand, you can't use it for anything. As a district, we spend by UCOA codes $30 to $40 million each year supporting multilingual learners. So there are expenses that we have that are allowable for it. But obviously we want to do our best to make sure it's focused on supporting direct support to our highest multilingual learner students. It's just, I'll be candid in saying it's been hard from a funding source. This used to be $3 or $4 million each year and relatively flat to where you could, stable, and it was a targeted investment to where it's like your state aid is your unrestricted is dropping by 10 million and your categorical is jumping by 9, and you're then having to make it's hard. It is not about incremental investment. It's about like fundamentally rethinking about how you allocate funds. So it can be a challenge, and we're hearing that from other superintendents as well. No one has anywhere near the amount.
Both an increase that we've had. And like I was saying earlier, it's tough to act upon this large increase if it's not even guaranteed, and we won't know until May or June time period how you act upon that much money to increase and plan a budget that's supposed to be enacted on July 1st.
Thank you. Questions? Anybody else have any questions?
That's cool. Then I won't go line by line, but the fourth column is essentially the same thing as the second column, but assumes. The fifth column is the same as the second column. It just assumes that that the city maintains their $130 million, right? So then all the kind of changes in the other lines are the same, except a bigger revenue shortfall from the city.
Well said.
So the first and the first column and the fourth column are basically the same thing.
Correct.
And then the second and the fifth, and then the two change.
The changes are just the difference between the second and the first, and the
Okay.
fifth.
it just falls out flat. City aid, and if they went back to the 130, what that means. So just imagine you're planning for a $10 million decrease in revenue or a $27 million decrease in revenue.
So, slide 8, it's some scary numbers here, but I'll explain why. We kind of start from here, and then obviously it's still very concerning. But we kind of like this. I'll show you how we think through our budget. So what you'll see in that chart on the left is our current FY24 budget. Revenues in blue, expenses in orange, balanced. We then say, let's just assume no real changes. Just look at what our revenue is expected for next year, roll our expenses over, grow those by what we think we expect some of our expenses to grow, and start with what that opening gap is before any changes are made, knowing that we will of course make changes to accommodate it. So the decrease in 27 million that you see on the left-hand side is that scenario where the city maintains their contribution at 130 million. That again is some of what you see in the decrease in state aid, as well as a decrease from what was planned from the city, from the 147 to 130. So in this scenario, we're looking at it if the city continues to put us at 130. So part of that gap is roughly $28 million in revenue decreases. When we look on the right-hand side, these are starting expense increases, assuming, again, no staffing changes, no any changes, just kind of rolling expenses forward. We have some small increases due to labor contracts. 1033 and 1339 are in the middle of their contract. P2 is expiring, but there is less than a % increase at the end of their contract that we are obligated to pay for next year. We are anticipating some benefits increases for next year, and we'll explain more because we'll get more and more information from the city. With some charter expansion, we do expect the amount we pay out to students, to charters that educate Providence students, to go up. The biggest number, though, on the expense side here is the special ed tuitions. And so what you saw was a higher than expected cost this year will now be an increase on that budget line for next year. We then have some smaller increases in transportation, other services, and utilities. Right, so you add up a revenue decrease of 27.9, starting expense increase by 17.2. You get as big as a $45 million gap, absent any changes. So let us walk you through then on the following slide how that gets kind of chiseled down with a gap that still remains. So you'll see that the top line just nets out the revenue and the expenditure growth. That's the 45 million we were talking about on the previous slide. Let me walk through each of these reductions and that we have seen for the coming year. So school-based reductions, that is reductions at the school level. The vast majority of our expenditures are in salaries and are salaries at schools. And so what you'll see here are reductions at school, decisions that schools had to make, as we were giving out school budgets. We had a change in our contract with 1033, where the child care worker position, so we had this bifurcated role where you get teacher assistant child care workers. Those positions will be merged together, which will result in fairly significant savings to the district on child care worker positions. We are in the process we will be doing significant reductions in the central office. So obviously less than schools, but our central office is far smaller than our school budget. So this plus any the amount we have in ESSER, I think, is roughly a 10 to 12% decrease in spending in central office for this year. The next few come through some changes we're making to taking schools offline. So the first one you'll see is through some of the consolidation at JSEC and 360 through the merging of those two smaller schools will result in less kind of spending needed to keep the combined school funded. As we take buildings offline through some of our construction and through the closure of Gilbert Stewart, that will result in utility savings as well as some savings in custodial, snowplow, all that it takes to run those buildings. So we are anticipating some savings there. On the ESOL program update, while we will continue to fund and support teachers in their tuition reimbursement, we'd explored the idea of a in-house certification program so that on top of providing reimbursement, we'd be able to certify staff internally. That became cost prohibitive as we face the challenges for this coming year. So that's a program that we will not be continuing for the coming year.
Sorry, may I interrupt? So the tuition reimbursement is being discontinued as well as or just an in-house program?
Just the in-house program. So it never ultimately launched because it would have launched this coming year. But tuition reimbursement will remain.
Can you remind us of what that amount is that teachers are eligible for?
$8,000. So that covers nearly every program. There are some programs that people want to pursue their masters after that run a little bit more than $8,000. But if someone wants to be fully reimbursed, there are programs out there that do that for less.
Did they not launch because of the tuition reimbursement program without?
No, just because we didn't have the funding, we didn't have the money to sustain it for next year.
I think that was something that was requested, or some teachers or the union felt that would be a more efficient way of getting more people certified faster, or with less effort or less out-of-pocket expense than them needed to get reimbursed. But it sounds like it would be too much out of pocket for the district to be able to provide.
Yeah, it would end up being more cost. It's more costly to run this in-house. I think that the hope and the desire was that should we have launched it, it would have been a more tailored program, which would have been great. But on a per teacher basis, it was far more expensive than tuition. If we had the funding, we would have certainly wanted to pursue more.
All right, so you're not doing the EL certification, no?
We are doing the reimbursement, just not the in-house certification.
So teachers can still go and do that at some other
So I
place
thought
and then get $8,000 of that reimbursed for their
Right.
tuition.
I thought there was a law where y'all were supposed to do that in-house.
No, and we've discussed this, and we talked with I talked with Mary Beth about it last weekend. Not to say to put words in her mouth, whether she agrees with it or not. The state law mentions like districts should do things to support staff and getting their certification, including reimbursement, blah blah blah. There's been a few people who've interpreted that as saying, therefore you must offer an in-house program. But like, no, that's in no means what the law says. Just that people are committed, and we certainly are committed to maintaining the reimbursement, just not in-house program.
So the certification every year mandatory for teachers?
So they have to, you have to maintain a certification to be a teacher here. But this specific reimbursement that we do is for teachers getting their ESL, their English as a second language certification, because that's been a requirement under the Department of Justice that we better serve students, that we are getting, that a teacher that might be elementary teachers also now often getting their ESL certification as well, so they can appropriately service students that are multiple.
I'm just asking because, for example, if this is also like, for example, the $8,000 is for their, they want to further their education and also get that certification to continue getting the job. It's almost like, I'm never gonna have enough money to go and continue my education because I have to use those $8,000 for the certification that I need for my job. So it's almost like we're just forcing them to have just for certification.
Yeah, I would say the reason we require people to use non-ESL certification is because that's both a requirement under the Department of Justice. We also think it's important that our teachers are better equipped to support.
Oh no, yeah, I'm for it, but I'm saying, like, for example, for teachers that don't have to get those certifications because that's not the students that they serve, they have the full $8,000 to go and continue for.
No, this is just to cover ESL certification.
Oh, okay, that's what I want to know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bell times, we made changes at two schools, Pleasant View and VZ. to shift them from an earlier start to a later start. We did, Mr. Colorado isn't here, but we led a lot of the engagement we did with faculty members and families at those schools. So by making that change, we think we'll save roughly $800,000. And then we do anticipate some reductions in teacher assistant roles, not a substantial amount, but when we take all those together, that yields roughly $12 million in reductions. We then are able to look at some other funding sources that can be used to cover some of the expenses. So the additional categorical funds, some funds from IDEA, and then a small amount of the ESSER funds prior to their expiration in September. That would total another 16.3 million, which would drop the gap down from 45 million to 16 million. So not fully closed, but those are steps that we've already taken to pretty significantly reduce our gap for the coming year.
And so you would have to spend the ESSER money in September. That one.
Over the season, right?
By September.
Before September.
It's before September.
Yeah.
And then does the budget, when you're, sorry, I'm tired of words. When you're planning the budget, do you plan it assuming all teacher positions are filled?
No. So we have an attrition salary number that's built into the budget, assuming that some of those positions are going to be filled, or if we budget at X amount of dollars, so it's a higher range, and some of them are coming at a lower range. So we take those proportions, all those assumptions in what's called an attrition line. It's already built in, because if we didn't, our salary line would grow exponentially if we can take those, and you see a large, more than a 1% or 2% savings in your salary line. And so it doesn't make sense budgeting there. That's only going to be a savings, so might as well take that reduction in attrition and use potential.
So we did see some savings this year on the salary line because our vacancies were higher than what we had included on that projection. I apologize.
Well, I have a little one waiting for me to pick up.
Oh, please.
So let me push through the next slide, and then I'm happy to answer any questions on what we try to do is like talk through what are some of the changes we would anticipate for the good or for the bad in the coming months that could change that bottom line we were just walking through. So the first on the revenue side is state aid, and this is a bit what Chris had mentioned about the enrollment update. We do anticipate this being a positive change. As a district, we typically see enrollment growth over the course of the year. And so we know our enrollment has increased, and so we would anticipate seeing an increase there. And it's just a matter of knowing how much would come in the next few weeks. One that's a little bit up for grabs, frankly, is the other state aid. So there's talks of adjusting the funding formula. There's also, if that were to happen, I would not be surprised if categorical funds were adjusted as well. So I would suspect that other funds would stay roughly the same. But it's frankly, ultimately, the kind of the vote at the General Assembly towards the end of the spring. So that one is a little less clear about whether it would be positive or negative. On the city revenue side, that is in this, we've assumed that we do not get any increase above the 130. I don't think that's, I would like to think we will get something more than 130 because it's the law. But again, that continues to be a source of uncertainty. And then the last one is fund balance. And I could go in greater depth here if people would like, but when, I'll spend a minute here because it's important. In the spring of 2020, when the pandemic hit, we shut down all our schools. We weren't running buses, we weren't paying for utilities, we didn't have to substitute teachers. So the district ended up not spending a lot on operational expenditures in that spring. And if you recall at that time, we also didn't know how we were going to open schools in the fall. There was no stimulus dollars at the time. There's no state budget at the time. The state budget actually wouldn't be passed until December of that year. So those funds originally that we had reserve for that spring that we saved by not running buses was going to be used to open up safely in the fall. Fortunately, stimulus dollars came through. We didn't have to use those, but we then had a reserve funds that we could use should there kind of be a rainy day. And the reason that was important to us as a school district, under state law, we typically, if we were ever to run a deficit and overspend, the city would be obligated to pay. We agreed under the state intervention that if we were ever to run a deficit, the city would not have to pay for it. Therefore, we, like districts that are self-funded in this way, we have a reserve fund should rainy days happen. And obviously those rainy days are here. So fund balance is another source we have if we have to close a gap. But frankly, what is challenging, we will likely need to use some of that for the current fiscal year as well as the next fiscal year. So it can be spent rather quickly depending on where we get with city aid.
So what is that amount?
It's roughly $11 million now. And we had to use some of it to close last year when we reached our settlement with the city for less than revenue than we had expected. We had to use some of it last year. So we've already started to dig into it this past fiscal year, and we anticipate it both for this year and next year. On the expense side, benefits is one we're monitoring closely because it can have a significant impact, and we're in close conversations with the city because they have a vendor, Mercer, that does their benefits projections. So that's an area that can just have a big swing either way. We try to budget appropriately, and then we'll just have to see from the city where that number is. But we've had some preliminary conversations, and it does seem like it might be a touch higher than we had expected, but we're trying to, particularly as we anticipate FTE, fewer employees next year, that ideally we would then receive some smaller benefit contributions as well. The other three are other areas we'll just monitor the special education out of district because it's become an increasingly large part of our budget. We're just taking steps that we can to reduce it not only this year, but for next year as well. Because again, even a small savings there will go a long way, just as, development in the opposite direction would also cause challenges as well. Last slide. So
sorry, I
please
have
go
a
ahead.
question, and it's not really relevant to what we're doing right here, but it's
Okay.
budget relevant, and it's something I've been thinking about. So like with Gilbert Stewart closing, is there a way to save money or make money out of that in terms of, and I'm sure there's obvious things like the cameras and the new bubble, well, they're not bubbles anymore, but water dispensers, right? But also in terms of things like the architecture, like that's 100-year-old architecture, and there's a lot of people that would pay to have that stuff instead of just having the building be torn down. Is that something that's been looked into?
Oh, interesting. Well, we certainly will take there's smart boards technology, and that stuff is repurposed to other schools. I'm not sure about, at the end of the day, I'm not sure even if the district would benefit financially from that. I mean, because it's technically city property, whether they would do anything from that. But
I mean, if it's going to be demolished anyway, it would be,
Reutilize it.
unless the city's going to be like, oh, well, if you're going to do it, we want the money, which would be really greedy, and I feel like they'd get a lot of, what's the word, push things, push back if people were to talk about that. So.
Yeah, it's worth considering. I mean, listen, we got to be creative here. So any other?
I mean, it's beautiful. People will pay for that. So I just wanted to throw that out there. It's been on my mind.
Aubrey, that's something that we could raise potentially, both Zach and I could both raise that at the school building committee and maybe ask our, the project manager if they have ideas about that, and folks from the city do participate and are part of that committee. So that could be a question that we could pose in that space to see where that goes.
Yeah. I know they did that on the state level with some granite from the State House that was left over, and they sold that for, I forget how much, but it was pretty significant. There was a lot of interest because of the historical proportion with that. So that's a great way to be creative.
So next steps is we'll be back in front of the school board finance and probably the full board in both April and May April will probably be similar to this with more detail, more refinements. May will be when we'll do the more detailed ordinances, budget book, and then we'll be in front of the city council in May or June. So, I think big picture, what I'd say is we knew it was going to be a challenging year. I think we've taken the appropriate steps to reduce the expected budget gap, though there still remains some uncertainty as we're continuing through the spring. So we're doing our best to be thoughtful about how we budget and make sure we're not overly conservative and assuming the worst, but also making sure we don't extend the district in a way that we think we can run into financial troubles down the road.
May I ask a procedural question
Yep.
as a new school board member, and I know some others are new as well. So in this process, you're telling us here where you're presenting, what role, if any, does the school board play right now in approving that budget that you then bring to city council?
I would, in this capacity, it's advisory, so review, provide feedback. I think a vote like a recommendation, but it's not an ultimate. The approval authority lies with the commissioner, but the school board can certainly weigh in, provide feedback, but doesn't ultimately approve it.
I have a question too, back to the student-based budget.
Yeah.
When the principal is working on that budget, what is the expectation in terms of involvement of others? Like, I know the principal has the final say, and I know like prior principals really could just do what they wanted and not
Right.
include people. Is that changed? Are there other?
Yeah, I mean, the expectation is that they're engaging their community on it, and I would say to be fair to principals this year, it was a challenge because their allocations got updated a few times because we actually thought the budget was going to be far worse prior to the state budget coming out. It was a little bit better, and that allowed us to give more money to schools, and so principals had to readjust and do so the time they had to put them together wasn't as ideal. And I've said this to a few folks. It wasn't the case like, hey, you're getting $2 more. How are you going to spend that? It's you're getting $2 less. How are you going to make a difficult decision? And so I think some principals were better equipped to have those conversations with their community and others weren't. So I would say I think a big push for next year is as we start to get the technical stuff down with student-based budgeting is how we prepare them to have those conversations with their school community. Because the expectation is that they're having those conversations. I don't think we've given them as much guidance as we should have about how to have them in a way that you're not saying like, finding that right balance between not being so. It's ultimately their decision, right? It's not like they're going to have a school community vote, but we also don't want them to hide or not share things. And so we need to do a better job of helping them find that middle ground of engaging at the appropriate time.
So right now it's just expectations that are set. There's no real like protocol, like you need to have so many people outside of yourself in the conversation, or you don't have like.
That's what we need to get to. I mean, there are requirements that as a Title I district we're doing engagement for Title I purposes, but we need to probably beef up what we're doing on student-based budgeting more.
Because Title I, there's really not having anyone have any say in the budget at the end of the day. So that's. Thank you.
Good points. Well, does anybody else have any other questions? Nina? Very good. Well, thank you, Zach and Chris, for a very detailed overview, albeit sobering review of the 24 and 25 budgetary forecast. Having said that, we will move on to adjourning the meeting. Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I move the motion.
I second that. And at this time, the meeting has been adjourned at 8:17 p.m. Thank you for your time and efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Oh, nice. I think I saw you walking around.
Oh,
I
okay.